Hello and welcome to the Somerset Archaeological and Natural History Society, which is usually known as SANHS. My name's Lizzie Induni and I'm the chair for SANHS. This evening, Steve Parker will give his presidential address on the history of nature conservation on the Somerset Levels. Steve was born in Maidstone in 1958. He grew up in Kent and has always had a very keen interest in natural history. Since the 1980s, he's worked in nature conservation and retired from his job for Natural England in 2021. However, plainly in high demand, he was immediately elected chair of the Kenneth Allsop Memorial Trust. The Trust are the owners of the island of Steepholm in the Bristol Channel and responsible for the management of this small nature reserve. Today, Steve will talk about the challenges of conserving the Somerset Levels and moors by looking back over the past 100 years. Unusually, Steve will not be available to take questions at the end of the talk because he is, at the moment, on Steepholm. However, we did record this last week and I was able to ask him some questions at that time, as you will see. You can ask questions by emailing the webinars@sanhs.org email address, and we will forward your questions to Steve, who will reply to you individually. It's free to register for the talks, but a donation of £5 towards the ongoing costs of SANHS would be greatly appreciated. The donations button is on the SANHS website donations page. When donating, please label your donation Conservation Somerset Levels. To make things easier, a link to the donations page will also be posted on the chat button at the end of the lecture. So, over to Steve.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. So I'm Steve Parker. I'm the Vice President of SANHS, and I'm delighted tonight to talk to you about nature conservation on the Somerset Levels and moors. I just start sharing my screen and we begin to understand a little bit about the history of this important area. I'm sure you're probably all aware that Somerset, in fact Britain and the whole of the country, has got a biodiversity crisis and a climate change crisis. Earlier this year, the Somerset Wildlife Trust produced this report, the Somerset State of Nature report. This details the loss of biodiversity across the area. Tonight, I'm just going to focus in on the Somerset Levels and moors, an area known to many. It's an area crossed by a number of rivers, making it one of the most important wetlands in the whole of the British Isles. It's an area of grazing marsh with small herds of cattle and occasionally sheep, out wintering sometimes, but mostly grazing in the summer. If you go to the top of Brean Down and look inland, you can see a flat landscape intersected by a series of ditches. In this area, they're mostly sinuous, but if you go further inland, the ditches are straight, dividing the small fields up. These wet ditches are home to a wide range of plants and insects. The area has been well recorded for its biodiversity, and one of the first floras, a publication detailing the plants of the area, was by J.W. White. This is one of the best floras known, and it's really well written. And in there, White describes in some detail the loss of plants. And this was in the early 1900s. He talks about the area known as the turf moors. And the reason then that plants were beginning to be lost from this peat bog was peat extraction and drainage. A little bit later, The well-known botanist visited the area and came across a number of very rare plants. So Mr. H. Stuart Thompson visited there and came across a plant called Carex evoluta on a tiny site known as Sharper Moor Plot. Later, another extremely well-known botanist, A.G. Tansey, also visited the area. Tansey was really the founder of ecology in Britain, and he was the editor of the Journal of Ecology. He was a member, the president of the Field Studies Council, and the founding figure of the British Ecological Society. Sharper Moor Plot is a tiny field on the Somerset levels. It's in what is now known as the Evelyn Marshes. It's quite a small plot. It consists of an area of open heathland and woodland. Today, it's surrounded by water and is effectively an island in a restored peat extraction site. A lot of study was later carried out on the site by a SANHS member, Graham Ricks. Here's Graham at a SANHS meeting a few years ago now. He was a tutor and used the site for his students to understand the science of ecology, producing a great deal of data that allows us today to understand the interest on this site. Adjacent to the site is Street Heath, which is now a local nature reserve. In fact, it was a local nature reserve declared in 1973. It's owned by Street Parish Council, but is now managed by Somerset Wildlife Trust. And of course, the Wildlife Trusts were really important in the early nature conservation of the Somerset Levels moors. They were formed in 1964. The first meeting of 15 people was in the SANHS office in Taunton Castle. They managed these sites for many years, and they still continue to manage them today. One of the big impacts of the surrounding peat extraction was the peat shrinkage. We can see here the roots of these trees are now well above the ground level as the peat has shrunk. Water being extracted, pumped away to allow peat extraction. Another famous person in the story of conservation on Somerset Levels was Charles Rothschild. He founded a society for the promotion of nature reserves. That SPNR now becomes the Wildlife Trust. And this was in May 1912. The object of this was protecting special areas for the wildlife. And he produced a long list of sites that were suitable, or he thought were suitable for nature conservation. One of those sites, as I say, is Street Heath, which is now protected as a local nature reserve. So Harry Godwin, another famous botanist, visited the area in the 1930s. He was told of a find of Roman coins on Chatwick Heath. While visiting the area, he realised that the so-called heath is not a heath. There's never been one. In prehistoric times, it was a raised bog, or part of a complex raised bog series. Godwin, a very famous botanist, did a lot to understand the previous history of plant life in the British Isles, studying pollen and producing pollen diagrams. The study of vegetation carried on into the 60s when J.F. Hope Simpson first produced a map showing the plant communities on Chatwick Heath. Chatwick Heath, as we know it today, is an amazing nature reserve, but in those days it was subject to peat extraction. Peat then was cut by hand and stacked. In fact, there was a little railway that they extracted the peat from. This is the site of Mere Heath. It's now fully restored as a reed bed. But as you can see from this photograph taken in the early 1990s, the whole site was completely devastated by extraction of peat. The Nature Conservancy Council and English Nature, and now Natural England, started to restore these sites. And this was the first evidence, the first work of government bodies, nature conservation bodies. So just to briefly run through their history, in the Second World War, they started work on an Act of Parliament known as the National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act. In the 1970s, there was a convention on wetlands called the Ramsar Convention. In 1981, a very important act came along, and this is the Wildlife and Countryside Act. Into the 90s, there was the European Habitats Directive and the Conservation Habitats Regulations, as they're called. And then in 2000, the Countryside and Rights of Way Act. So a lot of acts of Parliament to try and protect nature. And the first way that the British government tried to protect nature was through the designation of sites of special scientific interest. And the first of those was at West Sedgemoor. This was in the early 1980s. As you can see from this slide, there was a little bit of conflict. At West Sedgemoor, the landowners did not want their land notified as a special site, and they fought hard against that. So the image here shows the infamous burning of effigies. These were, the effigies are of RSPB members, local Nature Conservancy members and the like. But the notification went ahead, and that started the search for the ways of trying to improve and conserve nature. This history of conflict is well designated in Jeremy Pursglove's Taming of the Flood. It was soon realised that landowners needed support if they were to manage in a more environmentally sensitive way. And that led to organisations such as Natural England and its predecessors producing something called an environmentally sensitive area scheme. And this was launched in 1987. One of the focuses of that early scheme was to protect and enhance the conditions for breeding waders, such as redshank or snipe, lapwing or curlew. Another focus was on overwintering waterfowl. So here on a flooding meadow here, we've got significant numbers of overwintering ducks. And indeed, the Somerset Levels and Moors is actually internationally famous for its overwintering populations of ducks and other wildfowl. To try and produce the right conditions for these waterfowl, there used to be a series of very old structures. These were known as stop log structures. And as you can see from the slide here, that they were literally managed by people bending over and banging in slats of wood. Later on, the introduction of LiDAR and modern infrastructure helped stop the drainage and manage the water levels. So here is the old Grey Lake sluice. This structure, once it was opened, literally drained large areas of the Somerset Levels. So in the early 2000s, the Environment Agency replaced that structure with this more modern structure that was better able at controlling and managing the water levels. Some examples now of sites where work has gone on to improve and help nature. So as back as far as 1961, there was an agreement at an area now known as Shatwick Heath, a nature reserve agreement. And there was then a series of designations on that land. and it became a site of special scientific interest. And it was from about 1994 onwards that restoration started. In 1998, there was a Heritage Lottery funding grant for the purchase of the adjacent Canada farm. Shatwick Heath has a range of habitats, and this map here shows the range of wetland types, from flower-rich meadows to open water to reed beds. Nowadays, we use aerial photography to try and understand the area a little bit better in the landscape. And in the foreground here, you can see some of the areas that have now been restored following peat extraction. In the 2000s on Shatwick Heath, there was a need for grazing. So the government brought in a series of cattle. These are red Devon cattle, and they can tolerate the tricky conditions that can sometimes occur in these wetlands. Wet woodlands are a constant feature or a common feature across the area. But a lot of work was done for this bird, the bittern. The bittern had declined nationally, in fact, gone extinct nearly in Britain, and then it slowly began to return once reed beds were restored in the area. You can see here the number of booming males of bittern. The recovery was down to the better management of reed beds. Conservationists today are using more and more high-tech tools, such as this drone that flies over the reed bed. And here they're focusing on the large white or great white egret. And this photograph in the top right-hand corner shows the nests of these birds. Now, this bird is actually a new colonist to the British Isles. The Somerset Levels and Shatwick in particular, the Avalon Marshes as we call it now, is really important for a wide range of new colonists, new bird colonists to Britain. So here on Catcot, we've got cattle egrets, and this would have been an extraordinary sight just 10 years ago. The wet woodlands are rich in their biodiversity as well. Some sites supporting, or they used to support, all 3 species of woodpecker. But it's the wetlands themselves that we need to focus in most appropriately. These are some plants that you find in mire vegetation. So the top one here, or the one to the right here, is a sundew. And here we've got some orchids that occur there. So we have retained some of these wonderful mire situations that other of them have been damaged. There are very few recorded examples of the loss of wildlife, but one species that did become extinct and locally extinct, and as far as I can tell is still extinct, is the marsh fritillary. The drainage and the cutting of peat also could damage the valuable archaeology in the area. So the landowners along the Shatwick Heath have started pumping water in. They started pumping water in the 1960s. And here's Dr. Richard Brunning reviewing the condition of the very famous sweet track that runs through the area. So by pumping water in, they're hoping to conserve the track. Moving away from Shatwick Heath, we come to West Hay Moor, another national nature reserve. And it's people like Bernard Storer that we owe a lot of thanks to. Bernard was a founder member or one of the important members of the Somerset Wildlife Trust, and urged the trust to buy up sites like West Hay Moor. And he's written a very good book called The Natural History of the Somerset Levels, detailing the early history or the history of the place and its wildlife. So there is a series of lakes, but again, importantly, there's a remnant mire there. This supports a wide range of biodiversity, from fungi to insects and some snakes as well. A tiny little plant. Here we've got something called veilwort. This is a bryophyte. As you can see, it's quite tiny, and it's dependent on an open peat. We used volunteers to record the distribution of this plant a few years ago, before the Wildlife Trust started what they call their West Hay Moor peat restoration project. The mire had started to drain. It had developed large cracks and would not hold water. That meant that it was starting to dry out and shrink. So the Wildlife Trust have spent the last couple of years producing a plan, a project to help restore this area. And here you can see the early days of that project, where they've produced a series of what they call cells to hold onto the water into the summer. Next door to West Hay, or close to West Hay, is another area called the Catcot Complex, and this is another nature reserve. It used to, in fact, be a carrot field. In the winter now, it's home to thousands of ducks. By managing it as an arable field for carrots, the peat surface shrunk and was prone to flooding. Another part of that is another site that's been restored. The Somerset Wildlife Trust call it the Great Fen. This slide was taken during the restoration phase, and nowadays it has been fully restored to a reed bed. If we move out of the Avalon marshes to the Parrot catchment, there's an amazing site called South Lake Moor, and in the background here you can just see Burrow Mump. There was a project in the late 1990s, early 2000s, to restore this plant to other sites. This is the greater water parsnip. And with help from Bristol Zoo, seedlings were grown on and planted out into the area. So this is an example of where you've lost a species and you're trying to recover that by reintroducing it. Pat Hill-Cottingham was one of SANHS's presidents and chairperson. She did an awful lot of work in the levels, including the driving force behind the publication of the Somerset Wetlands, an ever-changing landscape book. Here we see a recorded television program with Bill Oddie. It was early in the 90s that she discovered a small snail on the levels called the shining ramshorn, Segmentina nitida. She spent a lot of time studying this animal and has produced a management plan to protect the animal in the long run. It's very tiny. It's only the size of a grain of rice. South Lake Moor is another important site for its biodiversity and wildlife. In the wintertime, this lake floods, the area floods. And that's a deliberate act on the part of the IDB and the landowners to produce a habitat for the birds. So if we climb to the top of Burrow Mump and overlook South Lake, we can see in the summertime it's just a series of wet fields. But the internal drainage board rebuilt structures, and now we're able to flood the moor. And that's done for the benefit of birds again, for waterfowl. Close to is the site of West Sedgemoor. Just above West Sedgemoor is Swalewood. And this is one of our important sites for a heronry. The heronry has been known there for over 100 years. The herons nest at the top of these oak trees, and it's one of the most active heronries in the county. It was a few years ago now that the RSPB, together with other organisations, started the restoration or the reintroduction of cranes into Somerset. So this was the Great Crane Project, and that's been very successful. The birds are now back in Somerset. They were brought as eggs from Germany, raised from eggs and then released as young birds onto the levels, and successfully, as I say, they're now breeding in Somerset. Damon Bridge was the officer responsible for that. He worked for the RSPB, and that's been a very successful project. Another successful project was the creation of a new wetland at Sturt Marshes. This was some 10 years ago, where the seawall was breached and farmland was allowed to be inundated by the sea in Bridgewater Bay. This is now a super reserve visited by lots of people. It's got some wonderful hides to go and look over the wildlife areas and understand what grows there. It's not only an area where the sea comes in, but there's also quite a nice freshwater wetland there as well. Back in 2012, 2013, 2014, there was a series of floods. Winter flooding is still common on the Somerset levels. This flood in the winter of 13-14, was very long. It was 4 or 5 months long, and it attracted national news. In fact, Prince Charles, as he was then, visited the area, and this made headlines across the world, around the world. In total, about 200 houses flooded, and there were repeat calls to start dredging the rivers again. And that, in fact, happened as soon as the water levels receded. Dredging started happening again. That led to eventually to the Somerset Levels and Moors Flood Action Plan, a project that's been still ongoing today, I understand. So winter flooding has been a constant problem across the Somerset Levels and Moors. Less common is summer flooding. However, these floods can have a really significant impact on the environment. So here we can see a flood in 2012, in the spring and summer of 2012. And the water turned absolutely horrible. It turned anoxic, and it killed off large areas of grassland. So here we've got, after the flood, the fields killed of grasses. But it's a wetland, and it did recover, and as far as we can tell, the wildlife survived and bounced back. But there is an ongoing issue with wildlife on the Somerset Levels and Moors, and that's the issue of very high phosphate levels. And here we can see them being measured. These phosphate levels are really bad for the wildlife. The problems come from a series of sources, from sewage treatment works, from runoff from farms and whatever. And there's a lot of action being taken now to try and restore and lower the phosphate levels. So that's one of the outstanding issues across the whole of the Somerset wetlands. We know a lot about the wildlife of the levels through organisations such as Rome, Recorders of the Avalon Marshes. So here we can see volunteers collecting various records, botanical records, biological records in the area. And so some good news was that in a few years ago now, these two gentlemen, Bill Irwin and Fred Giles, rediscovered an animal that was thought to be extinct. This is the large marsh grasshopper, our largest grasshopper. And it was last seen in 1994, but refound by Fred and Bill. And subsequent surveys have confirmed that it is in pretty widespread now. So whether it actually was extinct and just at very low numbers, or it has reintroduced or reflown into the area, we're not fully aware. So Rome encourages people to study the wildlife and understand what's here. and we're using more and more modern techniques, including the use of DNA sequencing, so we can better understand species that are here. We encourage people to get involved, and you can get involved and learn a range of new skills. So here we've got someone telling us a little bit about how to identify flies. They might not seem exciting to many people, but they are quite a diverse group. And conservation flies is about protecting their habitats, and that's the key to most things, really. All of the data they collect is now being put on a system that is managed by the Somerset Environmental Record Centre, and we just got a snapshot of a map of the distribution of some species across Shatwick Heath, and then you can interpret that map and get and look at all the data. So I've said there's a series of sites of special scientific interest and reserves, and 2 years ago they were all joined together in what is now called the Somerset Wetlands National Nature Reserve. And this is it's the third largest national nature reserve in Britain, in England. And it was declared at the Festival of National Nature Reserve Summer Programme when they celebrated 70 years. It includes places like Burham Mumps and the Sturt Marshes. These are jewels in nature's crown. Wild places are important for people too, and recently there's been major upgrades to the Allan Marshes Centre. This site now attracts some 80,000 visitors per annum, which is good for people, but it's also very good for the local economy as well. Over a year, 120,000 people have visited the Allan Marshes. So it's a place that people love, and it's a place that people value when they visit. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed that. If there's any questions, I'm very happy to take them.
Steve, that was really good, and so many thoughts coming into my head of questions that we can talk about. And it leaves me feeling sort of a mixture of panic about things that are disappearing, yet heartwarming stories from all the people who are, I don't know, really involved in helping nature conservation on the way, and what what a difference it's making. And I think anybody involved in nature conservation should be very much commended for their hard work. I mean, and it is hard work. You're out there planting reeds and surveying butterflies and things like that. Yeah, really fantastic work, and it's great. But of course, it's not enough, really, is it? I mean, there have been so many challenges which presumably continue to this day.
Absolutely, yeah. The story's not ended by any means. We've got some very nice nature reserves, which
Yes,
people
yeah,
love and visit. But across the whole of Somerset, as I say, there's a biodiversity crisis, and we
yes,
need to do
yeah,
more. And
yeah. I mean,
we're
you'd
not
think with all
done
that
enough.
you would have come to an end to it and it'll be all perfectly all right. But of course, things don't get better, do they? In many ways, you're fighting different problems than the ones you were fighting 50 years ago or 100 years ago.
Absolutely, those botanists that visited in the beginning of the 20th century, they wouldn't recognise the place now. They wouldn't recognise the challenges that we have with climate change, with the biodiversity crisis that we've got.
Yeah, I mean, that would be a terrible future to come back to, wouldn't it, really, if you were them?
Yeah.
Yeah, yes. So how is it now? Those rather shocking images, I suppose, with the owners back in when was it? Did you say it was 1990?
No, it was the early 1980s. So West Sedgemoor was notified in about 1983, 1984.
Yeah,
It was probably very badly handled then. This was the first SSSI notification using the 1981 Act. And what happened is that landowners received a letter with a long list of things that they had to talk to Natural England or the NCC, whatever it's called, those about, and they just it was badly handled. I think we can be assured of that.
Yeah.
So it just set off in the wrong foot. I mean, obviously it blew over eventually, and 99.9% of landowners are very happy to work with the conservation organisations now. For example, the RSPB use local graziers to graze their land. So does Natural England. So does the Somerset Wildlife Trust. So there's a good working relationship now, but it didn't start off good in that area.
Yeah, people would have seen that. Landowners would have seen this as a terrific challenge, I suppose, to their ownership of their land.
It was. So before 1981, before that act, there were sites of special scientific interest, but they were rather toothless. They didn't stop people doing things. So the act has been upgraded several times, right up until 2000 when different acts came in.
Yeah.
So SSIs have been a success, but of course they don't cover the whole county. They don't cover the whole of the levels. And it's outside of that in the wider countryside that we've seen the biggest losses of wildlife.
Yeah.
And it's lucky we've had the SSIs because they are really important. But people realise now that those little islands of biodiversity are not what's needed. It is the whole country that really needs to manage in the land in a more sustainable way.
And that's going to be really tricky.
It is, yeah.
Yeah. Hey ho. Well, let's hope for the best. Of course, there's further different challenges now with climate change coming up. Well, increasing, I suppose, and presumably that would affect the water levels on the Somerset levels. You get different rainfall, don't you? You get heavier rainfall sometimes in the summer than when you might not have expected it in the past.
Yeah, I'm sure there's going to be huge challenges. As most people know, the moors, the inland moors, are below sea level, and sea level rise is a real thing, and it's going to be a threat in the future. They are now currently building a barrier, a parrot tidal barrier, to stop the inundation of the sea into the levels, but that's going to solve some problems in the short term, but in the much longer term, of course, the levels are likely to return to a salt marsh saline sort of habitat, and who knows what the area will look like in 500 to 1,000 years time. It will be very different. The book that was published by various people 10 years ago talked about an ever-changing landscape, and that is exactly what we've got. So what we get now will be different from 500 years in the future, as it was very different 500 years in the past.
Yeah. Do you think it would be beneficial to wildlife, or yet again there'll be just different challenges for and against?
I think there will be different wildlife. So great white egret and cattle egret have come to this country. They've come here and they've sort of started to breed here. That would have been unthought or unthinkable even 50 years ago. So I think the wildlife will change. You'll get different species coming in. It's easy to spot when it's a great big white bird, but when it's an insect, it's more challenging. But even now, I think in the last few months, we've seen new species of dragonfly starting to breed and turn up in the levels. So things will change.
Yes. Yeah, very exciting. And how about the good old phosphates? We hear a lot about phosphates in the news, particularly in Somerset. Is that being mitigated, or does it not
improve? It's a huge problem.
It's a massive problem, isn't it? Yeah.
It is, and it's not something that can be solved at field by field level. It's not something a Somerset farmer can deal with. It's got to be dealt with across the whole of the catchment where these phosphates are coming from.
They're presumably leaching in from all directions.
They're coming in from sewage treatment works.
Yeah.
They're coming in from soil that's being washed off. If you live in Wellington, in a flood situation, in a heavy rainfall situation, the River Tone literally goes to a chocolate brown colour, and that's phosphates being washed into the area, and they all
Really?
end up in the Somerset levels, which is effectively a great bowl. So the phosphates have built up over centuries, I guess. And what do you do
Sure.
with them once they're there? They're very difficult to get rid of.
Yes.
So they can do work with the sewage treatment works, but there's a lot more to be done. It's a
And
big
every
problem.
time it floods, you get more phosphates coming through.
Yes,
It's
I
not like
don't
you
know of
can.
any way that the phosphates are actually being stripped out of the area of the ecosystem.
No, it's not like you can plant yellow rattle and have, have it disappear.
No,
No.
well, you can do some small scale interventions,
Yeah.
but effectively it's a whole catchment thing, and that's a large catchment on the
That's
Somerset level.
challenging. Yeah. Yeah. But there are lots of benefits to having wildlife areas. The Avalon Marshes, and I visited only the other day, is a fabulous place to visit. You must, and so encouraging to think that there are about 120,000, did you say, visitors a year there? Which is
Yeah, so that's
phenomenal.
the latest data that Natural England can produce. Says that's 120,000 visiting Shatwick, Hamwall, and probably places like Catcos as well.
Mm.
Now
So that's
that's not 120,000 different people. So there might be quite a lot of return visits in there. Local people go there every
yeah,
day
yeah.
to just walk along the
Oh
drove or
yeah,
whatever.
it is wonderful and
Yeah,
such a great place to visit because you can get cups of tea and all kinds of things. And there is archaeology at the Avalon Centre, quite a
there
lot of it.
there is indeed. Yeah, yeah. Well, the Somerset Levels is very important for its archaeology. It's probably as important for its archaeology as it is for its wildlife.
Yes, I've
We got
just
places like the Glastonbury Lake villages, the
absolutely. Well,
Sweet Track.
I
Yeah,
knew nothing of the Glastonbury Lake villages till I went and visited the Avalon Centre, and then I went off and bought a couple of really lovely little books about it, and such fantastic archaeology because they were digging right back in the 1880s. A chap called Bullard, and the sort of standard of archaeology was extremely good. He was doing sort of looking at seeds and all kinds of things 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago.
yeah,
So yeah,
yeah,
very, very exciting stuff.
yeah.
And I think the important thing to remember, of course, is that it's the peat that conserves all the artifacts so brilliantly.
It is. Yeah, yeah. Uh, the peat's really important from another point of view, which is storage of carbon.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
listening to the Wildlife Trust very recently,
Yeah.
they've now, or their scientists have now worked out that we're not storing carbon, we're actually emitting carbon on the Somerset levels and moors. So there's a big push now to try and stop that
Wow.
greenhouse gas by re-wetting large areas, and a lot's going on. So
That is so
we look into the
difficult.
future, and there's a lot of challenges, not only phosphate, but other
Yeah,
challenges as well.
that's kind of sad, isn't it? When you think you're re-wetting things and it's going to be really good, actually, it's got problems even doing that.
Well, at least we've recognised the problem now.
Yes.
So that's it's the first step,
Yeah,
isn't it,
it is
to
indeed.
recognise the problem? Yeah.
Wow. This we could talk all evening about this because it is quite an
Yeah.
interesting subject. I'm so pleased that you've done this as your presidential address, which of course for SANHS is an important thing. And we can be able to put it onto YouTube so people be able to watch and rewatch this fascinating subject. Thank you ever so much, Steve. Really value your talk tonight.
Okay. Thank you. It's
Yeah,
been a pleasure.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So there we go. Fascinating watching recorded events. Um, so thank you everybody for watching. Don't forget that you can actually ask Steve questions, but email him on the webinars at SANHS email address, and we can forward your questions to him there. Because remember, he's happily ensconced out on Steep Home right at this moment. We've got some more events coming up at SANHS. It's a good month coming up because we've got three events at the Wyndham Hall. Wyndham Hall is the SANHS building right next to the museum in Taunton. Next Tuesday, on September the 24th in the evening, James Spencer will be talking about Somerset's militia and volunteers in the 19th century. That's at 7:30. Following week, on Tuesday the 8th of October, we've got a talk on John Perriam of Milverton. On the 12th of October, which is a Saturday, we've got two events going on that day. In the Wyndham Hall, we've got a talk about the SANHS Herbarium, very, very important collection. Don't forget that. That's in the afternoon at 2:30 at the Wyndham Hall. But also on that day at the South West Heritage Trust, there will be an event to look at the SANHS library. For all these things, do go onto the SANHS website to find out more information. Our next webinar will be on Thursday, the 24th of October, and that will be about Antarctica, and that's by Richard Bashford. So plenty going on, loads going on this year for SANHS. It's our 175th anniversary, and with lots and lots of things happening. So thank you everybody out there in webinar land, and especially thank you to our webinar team working away there behind the scenes, Nathanael, Allan and Tony, and thank you all for coming and listening tonight. Okay, bye-bye.